This next one is a very precise game between Levon Aronian playing white and Hans Niemann with black. Terrific game in the Nimzo Indian. And Hans eventually went with the d6 variation. The idea is to support the pawn push e5 to e4 so that you hold this e3 pawn down, and in doing so, trapping in this dark square bishop. So Levon countered it with pawn to f3, supporting the e4 square. Then followed c5, and here comes the first novelty of the game, knight to a5. The threat here is extremely direct, going after c4. So if white plays a nonchalant move like castling, black will immediately reroute the knight to b6, and now white has no way of defending the c4 pawn. So noticing this, white came up with a different plan, and that is pawn to e4. And the idea is, in the time that it takes black to move the knight to b6, white will be grabbing a lot of space in the center. So for example, if black were to greedily capture on c4, yes, white is down material, but now has pawn to f4, and is basically saying that black has spent so many moves on knights that now being down one pawn is not a problem at all, because white will have an easy kingside attack with this rook lift, with this knight getting involved on g3, and the queen landing on any number of squares to launch an attack. So Hans probably saw all of this and decided that this center is a bit too much, and began chopping away with c takes d4 and d takes e5. And here comes a little trick. You cannot routinely capture on e5 because of knight takes c4. Now if you're tactically observant, you may notice that queen c2 forks the h7 pawn and the c4 knight. But the problem here is that the e5 pawn is also hanging now that there's no pawn on d4. So black is up 2 pawns and can afford to spare 1. And if you're not looking for tactical compensation, the alternative would be pawn to f4, trying the same idea as earlier with this rook lift and the same kingside attacking idea. Now the difference is, there are no more pawns in the center, which allows black to generate counterplay very easily. I'm going to do a side-by-side comparison. If you were to look at this other line, where there are many pawns in the center, white basically has a monopoly on all this action without needing to worry about the queen side. So that's the key difference here. And all this is to say that after d takes e5, white cannot capture this pawn just yet, so had to go c5 first, and only now that there's no more target on c4, could capture on e5. Black decided to challenge the center with b6, and white kept the tension with queen to c2. The reason you don't want to take on b6 is that this a file will open up, allowing black to trade off their bad light square bishop for white's good light square bishop. And so that's why queen to c2, which also gives a little jab to this h7 pawn. Black saved the pawn with h6 and now came rook to b1. But I want to point out an interesting alternative. White could consider grabbing a bunch of space here with c6. Now this space is not for free. There's a reason why Levon decided not to play this. And that is, the position can get a bit complicated when you grab space while not being properly developed. In this case, black has queen to c7, attacking this c6 pawn, which is the most valuable pawn, and so you'd want to defend it with knight to d4. And then comes queen takes e5. So white is down a pawn, but can say that, you know what, I have this strong fianchettoed bishop pointing at your king, and I have this thorn in your position. And all in all, I would say it is adequate compensation, but it can be complicated, because if you lose this pawn, then you're down 2 pawns and the game is basically over. So that could be a very sharp position, and that's why Levon went with rook to b1. And one thing I'll point out here is that Hans also wants to keep the tension on c5, because if you relieve it with b takes c5, then comes queen takes c5. The queen was previously tied down to the defense of this pawn, but now, not anymore. This queen is free to go to d4 and then e4 and checkmate black. So that's why Hans decided to go with bishop to d7 instead. This move serves multiple purposes. You keep the tension here, so the queen remains tied down. You also stop the pawn from moving to c6, and crucially, you're controlling the a4 square, because this queen actually likes to be on the other side of the battery, and a4 was a really good square for that. So it's nice that this bishop stops it ahead of time. So white continued with knight to g3, rerouting the knight to e4. And from e4, it can go to any number of squares. There's c5, there's d6, and potentially f6 if a kingside sacrifice were to present itself. Now another thing is that white is basically saying this e5 pawn is at least partially poisoned. It's similar to the other line that I showed you. If you take on e5, then comes bishop b2, and you have to deal with this powerful bishop yet again. So Hans went with knight to b7. This b7 knight directly counters the influence of this e4 knight. And with the pressure building on c5, Levon decided it's time to relieve the tension with c takes b6, and the queen's also come off the board. Now the main downside in black's position is this b6 pawn. It's really under fire, and the d5 knight is the only defender. So white immediately attacked this knight. The threat is to take on d5, removing the defender of the b6 pawn. Now whenever you're in these positions, passive defense trying to hold on to this b6 pawn will often fail, because if you're passive, white will have the freedom to build up and mount pressure on the pawn, and you lose it anyway, and you don't have any piece activity. So Hans correctly decided, there is no time to waste, let's just get the pieces as active as possible. Now here you can't take this c5 knight, because then the pawn moves to c5, and this pressure is taken off. So came bishop takes d5 and knight to d6. This knight is very active, and this pawn is still hanging. So Hans decided, activity over material. Time for pawn to d4, giving up the pawn. But now that white has went pawn hunting, instead of developing, black now has control over the b file. If not for this bishop, if white had an extra move to put this bishop somewhere, he could support the b file with rook to b1. But now that's not the case. The b file, or perhaps the a file, belongs to black. White played rook to b4, and black immediately made use of this extra activity. Thanks to the rook on the b file, the b3 square now belongs to the knight. And this knight is also very helpful in helping this pawn promote. White then continued with pawn to h4 to free up this h2 square for the king. Now you might be wondering, why not just use the f2 square? It's not like there's any back rank issues. The reason you don't want to use the f2 square is that white is very weak along the second rank, and black can immediately exploit it with rook takes b4 and then rook to a2 check. And there are so many things white needs to worry about here. There's this relentless pressure on the g and h pawns. There's this d pawn marching down the board, and potentially a pin along the last rank should this rook ever become unprotected. So that's why instead, pawn to h4. And one extra benefit of this pawn move is that it prevents g5 from being played, which means this bishop potentially has the f4 square in the future. So this shows that both players are understanding the dynamics of the game very well. Initially, instead of defending this b6 pawn and being passive, Hans decided, I'm going to give up this pawn and become active. And now, to defend against this activity, with the rook and the knight being involved, Levon decides I'm going to play more solidly and I'm going to give up the pawn. And how's the pawn given up? It's given up by rook takes b4 and then rook to b8. It is very, very difficult to defend this b4 pawn because black has a good clamp on the b5 square. So really the only way to hold on to it is bishop to a3, which happened in the game. But this bishop is now extremely passive. And in only a few moves, you realize that this pawn is coming down to d2. And eventually, this bishop has to surrender control over b4 anyway. The idea is to reroute to c3 to pick up this important d2 pawn. So we see some liquidations. Black grabs a pawn, bishop c3, grabs a second pawn, and then knight to e4. And white is confirming that this pawn will be lost. So after all that, material is equal, and Hans found a very clean way to simplify everything. Rook takes e4, giving up the exchange, but then winning the exchange right back with bishop g4, controlling the promotion square. So rook d2, and we get into an opposite bishop endgame with a draw by repetition. And this is what truly top-level precise chess looks like. Two players, each relentlessly posing questions, each answering with perfect calm. The struggle is intense, but very hidden in plain sight. And to the untrained eye, it looks extremely effortless because every challenge is met so cleanly, you don't even notice it. It's only beneath that surface that you realize that there's a constant storm of calculation and counter-calculation, threat and reply, idea and refutation. And that's the beauty of elite chess. The problems are so subtle and the solutions are so elegant that the game looks simple even when it's anything but. So that's it from me. Subscribe if you enjoyed this video to support the channel, but don't turn on the bell icon because I'm going to start uploading a lot more videos and it can be annoying. So have a wonderful day and I'll see you in the next video.